Michael Ringel, who needs very little introduction. He's been involved as a senior person in the Boston Consulting Group for some time, has given a lot of thought to some of the strategic aspects of healthy longevity. And we're going to talk a couple of topics today from my 10 Wicked Issues. We're going to talk about, Michael, the science base and the gaps that you see still needing to be filled in the science base if we're to move forward in this critically important area. And then secondly, let's talk about the public and political narrative that needs to surround this area, because I know you have some strong views about that. Will that be okay?
That's fantastic. And I should just say thank you so much, Richard, for having me. I mean, the way you've laid out the 10 Wicked Issues, I think is really crystallized for a lot of people how to think about this. And it's really a pleasure to be able to discuss some of those issues with you.
Excellent, excellent. So let's start with the first issue, which is the science and the science base. You and I attend conferences which have a lot of exciting science in them. But I think you and I both share the view that some of the critical scientific knowledge or scientific understanding is still missing. So tell us a little bit about what you think the priorities are in this field in terms of creating a coherent and reliable science base.
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, there are great scientists in this field and incredible science for them to be working on. Unfortunately, it's still an incredibly small field, and I think we'll come back to this in your second question around policy and funding, as obviously as a piece of policy. If we look at the throughput of just publications that have aging in them, right, versus take a compare, excuse me, compared to like oncology, it's something like a 40x difference in the amount of activity. Now, you know, oncology is incredibly important, right? We all care about it. Many of us have loved ones that have suffered cancer. We've made great progress there in bringing rates down. But it is just one of many age-related diseases. And, you know, there are a host of others that matter as well: cardiovascular diseases, neurodegeneration, and so on. Aging is an intervention point that has a potential to affect all of them. And so arguably it should have more activity, not less activity. And so no denigration on the quality of the science, but it's just a volume problem. We don't have as many researchers and as much activity as we need to make progress in the field. Having said that, there's some incredible activity. I mean, I think the gap, maybe I'll start with the gap rather than the activity. The gap is we haven't made a big breakthrough in, let's say the last 10 years. There was a kind of a seminal moment in the 90s when we had the first identification of, hey, this is genetically regulated, it's manipulable. I think a lot of evolutionary biology told us it should be manipulable, but we finally had the data to show that with work from Johnson and work from Kenyon showing that. Then we had a big break in the 2000s with the National Institute of Aging's Interventions Testing Program, ITP, where they showed for the first time that not just a gene, but I can just give a drug to a mouse and make it live longer, a mammal. And so we knew, kind of these big moments open up the field. We haven't had one since then. Still the state of the art is the interventions that were identified in those, mid 2000s. And, that's quite a gap. I'm very optimistic about some things that are on the horizon, like partial reprogramming. This is the incredible technology where you can reprogram a cell and turn it back to stemness. And that does two things. That changes the identity of the cell. If it was a skin cell or a nerve cell or a muscle cell, it's now a pluripotent stem cell. It could be anything. But it also changes the age. If you grow that stem cell into an adult, it'll start out as a baby. If you remember Dolly the sheep, a cloned mammal, it started out as a baby. And so two things that change are the identity and the age of the cell. And the question is, could you decouple those and do what's called partial reprogramming, where you don't change the identity? You want to keep your muscles as muscles, your nerves as nerves, your skin as skin, but change the age of those cells with therapeutic benefit in age-related diseases. And I think that's something that's on the horizon, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done to turn that into reality.
Sure. No, that's I think a very important perspective. And right at the end there, you said, as we both know, aging and the aging of the cell and the aging of the organism is directly related to the appearance of chronic disease. And chronic disease gets funded very heavily, not just, as you mentioned, cancer, but diabetes, heart disease, and so on. Do you think we have made a sufficient connection between the processes of aging and the emergence of chronic disease?
Well, it depends how you're asking that question. Intellectually, absolutely. In the minds of the public and policymakers, absolutely not. So, the phrase for this is the geroscience hypothesis. I think Gordon Lithgow, who's at the Buck Institute, was the one who coined the term. And there's tremendous amount of evidence that, many chronic diseases go up exponentially or nearly exponentially with age, right? You don't get Alzheimer's as an infant. But it's not just neurodegeneration, it's cardiovascular diseases, it's cancer, it's metabolic disorders like diabetes and so on. We have not thought of age itself as an intervention point because you can't change your chronological age. It goes up one day every day. But if in fact you can change your biological age and use that as a manipulation point to address these chronic diseases, it becomes very powerful. And there's a lot of evidence for that intellectually, and I think a lot of knowledge of it within the scientific community that works on it. But I think it is vastly underappreciated outside of that small community. We don't have recent surveys, but Pew did a survey in 2013 asking about people's level of knowledge in this area. And, not surprisingly, right, the public isn't focusing on this day to day, but it's something like, fewer than 10% of people that think they know anything about this, much less, details like the geroscience hypothesis.
Sure. And of course, we know that with age, all of these, many of these diseases increase, and to some extent exponentially when you get into the 70s and 80s and so on. But have we made a sufficient scientific causative link between those mechanisms that we know are going on in the aging process and the emergence of chronic disease? Or is that something we need to focus more on?
So I think there's a couple ways to come at that. So one is mechanistic, right? Do we have evidence that the mechanisms of aging biology affect the pathways that are known to be involved in these diseases? And the answer for that is yes. So for instance, one of the best known intervention points is mTOR for longevity. That's where rapamycin works, or on FKBP12 that binds to mTOR. Downstream of that is autophagy. This is the self-eating of the cell, the cell's cleaning and repair process that it then upregulates, for the pro-aging effect. We know that autophagy matters for neurodegeneration, right? You need to be clearing out damage and waste that's in the cell. So there's a mechanistic link between those. As just one example, I could give others, but
sure. So we've got most of that scientific argument made, but your other point is the policy community, the broader medical community, I would say, not just the people who formulate policy, but mainstream medicine haven't focused on this. And therefore, we have this huge disparity between what's spent on diagnosed disease and what's spent on aging and the connections that we've just been discussing. So let's move to that second question. So what does it take to get the attention of the policy community for this all-important shift? And it's a broader shift. If I use different language, and here in the UK, we sort of got the point politically. You shouldn't be treating disease, you'd be preventing it. So it's about prevention. So what do we need to do to kick the policy dialogue into that arena?
So my mental model of this is, let's say the end, I'm going to work backwards. The end point is you want to have therapies on market that address aging biology as a way to modulate age-related disease, to increase our health span and potentially even lifespan. In order for that to happen, you need pharma companies and biotech companies to be developing drugs. Well, most of those companies get their ideas for these therapies from academia. So in order for pharma and biotech to be able to develop new therapies, academics need to be working on identifying new pathways that could do this. Well, academics basically go where the funding is, right? If you can't get a grant, you can't do work. And so you need to move one step back and say, okay, well, for academics to do something, it has to be the agencies that provide funding need to be providing funding in this. And agencies, moving one step further back, get their cue from policymakers. And ultimately, policymakers get their cue, maybe not directly, but from the public. Where is the public interested? And so things like Alzheimer's do get a fair bit of attention, rightly so, because there's public concern about this. And so the answer to the how is we really need to be communicating broadly to the public, proselytizing around why this matters for each of us individually. And there's incredible arguments there. I mean, this is actually probably, there's some concern that, anti-aging technology is just going to be for the wealthy, but it's actually exactly the reverse. This is the most egalitarian kind of intervention because, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so it's actually very cheap to do things early on to keep you healthy. And that's the kind of thing that you can do at a population-based level, as opposed to very expensive, late-stage interventions. And so this is probably one of the most egalitarian ways to address healthcare. And, all of us obviously have an interest in living healthier and longer. And if people understood that this was a path forward, I think there'd be tremendous support.
No, I think you're exactly right. And the examples you give, like Alzheimer's disease, it's not difficult to get public attention for that. Everybody's got somebody, sadly, in their family or in their circle of friends. But what they don't recognize is that it is a preventable, or at least partially preventable disease. And the same with cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so on. And so I wonder what sort of public education program we're talking about, because the public doesn't sit back and want to be educated. It needs to be entertained, alarmed. These are the sort of words that capture attention. And I mean, to make your point about what I call serving the billions, not the billionaires. I did watch the Brian Johnson Netflix thing, but you would come away from that with the conclusion that aging was something that only very, very rich people can tackle. And you're completely right. We need people to understand that in all sectors of society, how you live, what you do, and to some extent the things you take can affect your aging and thereby affect your risk of these kinds of diseases. So can you formulate a practical proposal in this area?
Yeah, I think I'm not a great wizard, but I can reason by analogy. Others have done this successfully, and so we just need to think about the formula they used. And there are lots of examples of changing mindset outside of healthcare. How we thought about drunk driving in the U.S. How we thought about gay rights as another example, but I'll stick with healthcare. There are two examples that come to mind. The first is cancer. It's an older one, but I think a very instructive one. This was a topic that was taboo to speak about in the 40s. And as a result, not a lot of public interest, not a lot of policy action, not a lot of funding, not a lot of research activity. And one person, Mary Lasker, really took it on as a cause to say, let me change mindsets, let me proselytize. And they did opinion surveys, and you can watch the opinion surveys change from the 40s to the 50s when she was doing this work, from the majority of people unwilling to engage with their doctor around cancer to the majority of people willing to engage. And that started to put pressure in the 60s on policymakers around what are we doing about this? And that culminated in 1970 with the war on cancer. A bill was passed to say we're going to address this. We're on it. Our government is responsive to you. People are worried about this. We're going to do some action. That led to billions of dollars in funding in NIH. And you can see, if you look in the 80s, the trajectory of research, that activity, now that the funding started happening, it goes up by 15% per year. And there's a real kink, starting once the funding comes through. And by the end of the 80s, we actually already had some drugs. And of course, that's continued in the 90s and since then. Another kind of more recent example, that because many of us didn't live through the war on cancer in the 40s, and sort of that mindset change, but many of us do remember the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. And this was something that captured the attention of folks, just for a brief period, but got people really interested and actually resulted in not just the direct funding that people gave, but it became a multiplier effect. The policymakers and funders took notice, and there was a huge multiplier in NIH funding that went to ALS. And we now already have 3 drugs that have come out since that activity. And so this is not an insurmountable problem. We have known examples that we can copy to think about how we change mindsets and the value of aging biology as a tool to address multiple age-related diseases simultaneously.
No, I think those are 2 very good examples. I have a vested interest, I suspect you have too, in us addressing this problem not over decades in the way it did with cancer, but more in the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. So I really like that idea. Maybe we should have a beer sometime and devise what the Ice Bucket Challenge is.
As long as it's non-alcoholic, but yes.
Yes, a non-alcoholic beer. To design something that will really capture, or some things that will capture public attention. So let's make the assumption that we can put aging and the link between aging and chronic disease on the public, into the public mind and onto that agenda. What about the world of politics and the people who actually, as you say, start to direct funding?
Yeah, I mean, I am of the view that if there's sufficient public interest, it's not that policymakers are always immediately reactive to public desires, but that will be sufficient in and of itself to drive policy change. However, I'm certainly not, against direct engagement with policymakers, because they can also be part of helping to change public opinion, much less, also doing direct action. And of course, these are folks that are in public service. I tend to believe they actually, in large part, care about serving their constituencies and doing the right thing, and are open to logical arguments. And I think we have a great case to be made, with data, with examples around how this can actually help many of the problems that we face as society. We've talked a lot about the health side, but there's a huge economic side here that I think resonates deeply with policymakers. We've all heard about the gray wave, the impending aging of society that has a lot of economic cost to it. You both have reduced activity on those parts of those folks in terms of the just job working. Are they driving the economy that way? Are they acting as active consumers, driving the economy that way? So you have a depression on that side, and you have an increase in drawing down of benefits, including healthcare benefits, but also things like Social Security and so on. That's a problem, right? Many governments are looking at their coffers and seeing that this is going to be an issue in the coming decades. Health span extension has the potential to not just ameliorate and erase that, but actually create a tremendous value on top of that. And we're talking trillions of dollars of value by doing exactly the reverse, by increasing the period of time that each of us can be active, contributing to the economy, whether that's through work, or whether being as consumers, or whether supporting others, and then also delaying and probably also shortening the period of time that we need to draw down benefits, whether that's healthcare benefits or otherwise.
No, that's it. That's exactly right. And we have to change a little bit the paradigm in people's thinking It's a natural thing to start to think about retirement in your 50s, your early 60s. And of course, you won't be working by the time you're in your late 60s, and you'll be therefore dependent on the state, which is dependent on the shrinking number of economically contributing people. So we have to get beyond that and design an economy where those people later in life can make productive contributions to the economy and to society. I think that's exactly right. So I've noticed our time is slipping by, so to speak. Any final thoughts you have about the Wicked Issues agenda and how we might work more collaboratively, more consistently, in a more integrated way to tackle some of these problems?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of constituents who understand the value here. There are some foundations that are active in this. There are obviously the set of scientists that are working on this. There are people at agencies like the NIA that understand the value. There are some policymakers that are interested in, and so on. But it's highly fragmented. And I think there is a need for a consolidator, and particularly what we're lacking in all of that is a real push on the grassroots side. And so for some entity to take that on and say, okay, we need a grassroots policy agenda and an integrated approach against this. And I know you're doing some work in this regard. And so very much applaud that. As well as I mentioned earlier, like the clarity that you brought in terms of how we think about this issue with the 10 wicked issues list.
Yeah, so I think the extra thing that come through for me in this conversation is the need to start at public attitudes, public education, public awareness of the issue. And so if we do take a more integrated approach to this, we absolutely have to get people involved who are good at ringing the bell in public opinion, and not just the people like you and I who think about this, we hope, in a sensible, conceptual way, but somebody who knows, or some people who know how human attitudes and behavior get shaped. So, Michael, thank you very much indeed for spending a few minutes with us, and I look forward to the next time we meet, which I suspect will be at the Hevolution Conference.
I'll see you in just a few days. So looking forward to it.
Thanks again.